Davey, if you want to introduce our speaker for today, and then we will kick off the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm really excited to introduce most of you to Dr. Gerald Carter, but some of you already know Jerry from BAT meetings and so on. Jerry did his bachelor's at Cornell University and then went to the University of Western Ontario, now Western University, for his master's. And then he did his PhD research at the University of Maryland. He did a number of postdoctoral fellowships, one with the Ford Foundation, one as a Smithsonian postdoctoral fellow, and then as a Humboldt postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute. And since 2019, he's been a research associate with the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. He also, since 2018, is an assistant professor at Ohio State University, where he runs a behavioral ecology lab. You can find out more about Jerry's research if you want to dig deeper after his talk at socialbat.org. And I think, like, I am really excited that Jerry's here today because he always gives really engaging talks. So the first time that I saw Jerry speak was when he gave a presentation as an undergraduate at the North American Symposium on Bat Research. And it was actually my first time at that meeting. And I watched Jerry get up and give this amazing presentation about how he had tried to do something and it didn't work. And there was like a whole story from beginning to end, and where often I had seen people flail around going, well, this didn't work and I don't know what to do. Like, instead, he just turned it into this whole success story. And I have watched him do the same thing with successful stories since then, and it is always engaging and I always learn something. And so I hope that you will too. Oh, and I was supposed to mention that we did our master's together, and actually, who else is here? Lauren Hooton did her master's overlapping with us as well. So it's also a nice kind of reunion. So I will turn it over to Jerry to tell us all about the social lives of bats.
All right, thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Okay, so everyone can see my screen now, I hope. Thumbs up. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it because I got so many things to say. But thanks so much for inviting me to do this. This is really nice to be able to share without having to fly and all of the trouble of traveling is removed for these virtual talks. But yeah, it's great to be here virtually. Okay, so I'll just start by talking about cooperation and conflict in general. So over a century, over 100 years, biologists have been asking this very basic question of why does some organism have some cooperative trait? Okay, so why do worker ants forgo reproduction, work for their colony? Why do meerkats and other cooperative breeders do something similar where they have breeders and helpers? When you have exchanges in mutualisms like pollination for nectar, what prevents cheating? Why doesn't the plant just put nectar in only a few of its flowers to exploit the bee? Sometimes there is cheating like this. What prevents that? Why do humans have pro-social psychological urges to help people in need? So this study of cooperation and conflict is a huge interdisciplinary field. And the place where I want to start is just by pointing out that there's actually many different kinds of cooperation that exist along a spectrum of social environments with different kinds of what you might call social complexity. Okay, so not surprisingly, the kinds of cooperative traits you have are going to depend on the kind of society that you're born into. So if you're a female worker ant or naked mole rat, you would have these truly altruistic traits. Okay, so you'd be sacrificing your life for your colony, which is also your family. You might be a helper, you might be a breeder. Your inclusive fitness is tightly linked to the performance of your whole group. So Lucas and Cluttenbrock call this organizational social complexity. These are cooperative societies. Most work on cooperation tries to understand these kinds of societies because this is the clearest example of cooperation, like real reproductive cooperation. But on the other hand, if you're a primate, which you are, you don't really do that kind of extreme reproductive cooperation. So humans are not as altruistic as bees, and primate societies are complex, but in a completely different way. So some individuals in your social network are your kin, but most are not. And within the same social group, you might have a close friend, an associate, an ally, a rival, maybe a bully. Every relationship is different. Every individual can have a different social rank, And to navigate this kind of social world, you often act strategically, you groom each other in a certain way, you have relationships that can change over time. So Lucas and Cluttenbrock call this relational social complexity. And there's evidence for these kinds of relationships outside of primates, like in cetaceans or in corvids like crows. And what I hope to convince you of is that vampire bats are also an example of a species that has this kind of social complexity. But coming back to cooperation, one of the key facts I think has emerged recently in the field of the evolution of cooperation is that it's often stabilized by multiple factors. So for instance, we understand a lot about cooperation in eusocial insects. So we know that genetic relatedness is important because eusociality has only evolved in lineages with lifetime monogamy. But relatedness isn't everything. Cooperation is also stable because of the scale of competition. There's more competition between colonies and within colonies. Reproductive altruism is also enforced. Okay, so these are worker ants. They're actually punishing a worker that tried to lay eggs, which the workers are not supposed to do. And these ants are clonal, so their relatedness is 100%, yet there's still this cheating and this punishment of cheating. Here's the same thing. So this plot here shows that worker policing can suppress selfish reproduction, which the top panel is showing, but surprisingly, higher relatedness is correlated with more selfish cheating, more worker reproduction. So even among kin, enforcement is often necessary to suppress selfishness, even when you imagine that the individuals have fitness that is aligned in some way. And so moving from a cooperative society to a cooperative relationship, we can ask the same question. So what about these so-called social bonds that we see in primates like chimpanzees? Is cooperation actively enforced by strategic conditional behaviors like grooming and partner switching? So is there conflict that's being suppressed? Or are social bonds simple and easy because there's just very little conflict and a lot of interdependence between individuals? And it really depends on who you ask. So a common debate is whether cooperation in these long-term relationships is enforced by reciprocity or whether it's stable on its own, a scenario called pseudo-reciprocity. So reciprocity is there's conflict that's being suppressed, and pseudo-reciprocity is the conflict's already low before you even start thinking about how the animals respond to each other because they have fitness that is inherently correlated for some other reason. So you don't need to monitor and force anything because every investment is a very safe investment. So there's quite a lot of debate about this, but increasingly we're seeing that this is really a false dichotomy. And that's a point made by this 2016 review paper by Bashiri and al. And what they argue is that this is really a continuous spectrum. So on one end, you have this prisoner's dilemma situation where cooperation has to be enforced and you need something like reciprocity to stabilize it. And that's, by reciprocity, I mean in the broad sense of some kind of conditional helping or conditional punishment. But on the other end, you have two individuals whose fitness is inherently correlated, so there's no real conflict. And that's also a situation where I think the point of this paper is that both of these situations are not that likely to occur. And most situations are going to be somewhere in the middle. And that's possibly why there's been so much controversy around this. And so people who think reciprocity is important are using a definition that includes this middle ground, and people who think reciprocity is really unimportant are calling this middle ground pseudo-reciprocity, and reciprocity is all the way over here. So it's kind of a semantic debate. But I think one of the important points about this spectrum is that relationships can not only exist in this gray area, but they also could move back and forth in time as the relationship develops over time, over ecological time or evolutionary time. And so I think to study this, we really need to be able to track relationships from start to finish. And that's what I'm working on with the vampire bats. So starting in the mid-1990s, food sharing in vampire bats, which I'll explain in a bit, has been this textbook example of reciprocity, which is this idea that became controversial over time. But what I want to argue here is that vampire bats are actually a better example of how a cooperative relationship can be stabilized by multiple kinds of behaviors at once. And that cooperative behaviors or traits that evolve for one reason could be co-opted for another reason. So I'll explain a little bit about why vampire bats are a neat system to work with. The first reason is that they're just small. So they weigh only about 30 to 40 grams. And all of the drama of their life, most of it at least, occurs in these small spaces that we can simulate in captivity. So spaces no bigger than a closet. They roost in hollow trees or in caves, tight crevices, sometimes in bridges or other man-made buildings. We can simulate these in the lab, and they quickly habituate to captivity, and we can see them perform all the same behaviors that they would inside of a cave, inside of a space that we create. And vampire bats, as the name suggests, they feed only on blood, or at least the adults feed only on blood. They feed on milk as well. This was one feeding on a chicken's foot. They get 1 meal a night. They miss 2 meals. They're very weak. They miss 3 meals. They'll probably die. But they have this social safety net, which is this food sharing system. So unfed bats can come back to the roost, and they will receive regurgitations of blood meals, of ingested blood from their close associates. And these are often kin, but not always. And these donations are important in nature because the adults miss a meal about every couple of weeks, and the younger bats are missing a meal every few days. And we can induce these donations in the lab just by fasting a bat overnight and putting it back in, and then looking at who feeds it. And that's called a fasting trial. And we can do this in many different ways. So here's an example. We put a bat trapped inside of a cage. So we know the donors initiate most of the donations. They'll even go down to the ground and feed a trapped bat through the cage bars. They recognize each other using contact calls, and females are attracted to the calls of non-kin that feed them, but not to the calls of kin that don't feed them. And we've been doing these fasting trials for a really long time. So over 10 years, we've done almost 1,200 fasting trials now with different colonies and different places. And what I'm going to tell you about is sort of picking in different studies that we've done over the span of time. And the questions that I want to address are these. So why do vampire bats share food? How do these food sharing relationships initially form? And what is a relationship? What do we mean by a relationship? So I'm just going to point out the different possible options here. So why do they share food? Is it indirect fitness benefits, kin selection? Is it reciprocity in the form of conditional helping or conditional partner switching? Is it fitness interdependence, meaning that there is inherent correlation before you even think about reciprocity? Is it all of these things? I'm just going to jump to the conclusion here, which is that we have evidence that all of these things are important. I think all of these things are happening at the same time. And I'd like to just quickly show you the evidence for each of them. And for reciprocity and fitness interdependence, for reciprocity, it's very hard to show this, but I'll show you that what we've done so far, but we're still working on trying to really nail this down. And fitness interdependence is really hard to measure and test, and we haven't figured out how to actually measure it. But let me tell you a little bit about what we know. So the first thing to note is that food sharing is almost certainly co-opted from maternal care, extreme maternal care, even for a bat, which bats already invest a lot in their offspring. But in addition to that, vampire bats are extreme even for bats. So 1 pup a year. The gestation period is 7 months, which is really long for a bat. Nursing continues for 10 months, 3 times longer than other neotropical bats in they're closely related to them. This infant can be half their mass. They balance this slow reproduction with a really long lifespan. So we have records of bats living 17 years in the wild. They can live 30 years in captivity. And as far as we know, all the females feed their pups, and this continues when those pups grow up. The males disperse after their first year. The females are philopatric. The mothers keep feeding them. Eventually, the daughters start reciprocating. And I've seen daughters as young as 4 feed their mothers when their mothers are fasted, which is 4 months old, which is a bat that's still weaning. So that's incredible. And this food sharing is extended to other relatives, half-sisters, granddaughters. They have these matrilines within the colony. And these relationships tend to be symmetrical. So there's 2-way feeding. And you also see these weak 1-way relationships, but it's not clear if these are actually 1-way or if we're undersampling them and they're actually symmetrical. And no female feeds every bat in her group. Each female has her own network of donors and receivers. And many people are surprised to hear that 95% of the food sharing in vampire bats occurs with close kin, because we talk so much about non-kin food sharing, and that's sort of what's focused on in a lot of the literature. But 78% of this is just maternal care. 16% is with other kin. Only there's this 5% that's between non-kin. And at this point, it makes sense to ask, well, is this just kin selection? And the answer is definitely not just kin selection. And I'll lay out why this is. So the first thing that we know is that even when you control for kinship, the co-roosting predicts food sharing slightly better, and it's because you have bats that are moving around between these groups. They don't live in stable groups. They're not sharing at the group level. They're moving around, and it's the bats that are moving around together that are sharing food. And not all of these bats are related, and relatedness is a little better of a, or the co-roosting is a little better of a predictor. But when you control for association, you put all the bats together for several years so that everybody's familiar with everyone else, but they have very mixed relatedness. You have several match lines, just like you'd have in a wild situation. What you see is that the best predictor of how much bat A feeds bat B is how much bat B feeds bat A, and that's more important than relatedness. And so this is a food sharing network where the arrow from one bat to another is the donation rate given the opportunities to donate to the bat. You can see the red nodes are the females. That's where most of the food sharing is occurring. The blue nodes are the males. The size of the node is how many bats, other bats in their colony they're feeding. And so you see that there's all of these football shapes. These are the reciprocal food sharing relationships. And this is, as far as we know, the best predictor of one bat feeding another bat. The only way to really show reciprocity is to do a partner choice or partner switching experiment where you make a cheat and then you see how the other bat responds. And I've been trying to do this now for years. It's a very difficult thing to do. We have a design for doing it. It's delayed due to the pandemic, but I don't have results on that yet, but hopefully we'll that's sort of the nail in the coffin, so to speak, is to really demonstrate this. And it could turn out that that's not actually the case and that they don't respond to cheating at all, in which case this whole reciprocity thing might not be true. But I think that there's a lot of evidence that it is conditional on past experience. I think the best evidence for this, and the best evidence that it's not just a byproduct of kin selection, comes from the fact that non-kin adult strangers form food sharing relationships in a way that cannot be explained as making mistakes or phenotype matching, like feeding bats that smell like you, or being mistaken about who your relatives are. It just doesn't make sense. And so I want to dive a little bit into that next. So how is it that food sharing relationships form? How do new relationships form? This is something we don't really know much about from primates, because it's very rare that you would be able to see the moment that two chimpanzees or baboons in the wild, like when they first met. It's quite rare to see this, even though we know that individuals will be recruited into groups and these things happen. It's hard to just be there at the moment it happens. So some of the theory around this involves a strategy called raising the stakes or testing the waters. And basically what this means is that you make small cooperative investments at first, and then you gradually increase these over time to the partners that provide the best returns. So it's a way of sort of reducing risks, so you don't get in a bad relationship. You don't make a huge investment in an individual that's not going to reciprocate or cooperate with you. And so this has been shown in computer simulations, and it's been shown in humans playing sort of economic style public goods games. But what about in nature? Does it exist in nature? What would it look like in non-human animals? So one form it could take is that animals could transition between different kinds of behaviors that vary in cost. Okay, so if vampire bats transition from clustering to grooming to food sharing, that would be an example of raising the stakes. So they might try grooming. If that's reciprocated, they might groom more, and then eventually they might start sharing food with the individuals once they've already established the sort of trust from mutual grooming. And grooming would be a useful thing because you can sort of assess whether or not another individual is going to tolerate you and whether they're going to reciprocate immediately, because they will start grooming you or they won't. And I haven't talked about social grooming in vampire bats. This is a bat grooming itself. A bat that's grooming itself is actually several times more likely to be groomed by another bat nearby. They also try to groom each other's bands off. And if we mess up a bat's fur, make its fur all wet and nasty, other bats will groom them more. So it's not just something that's it's directed to particular individuals. And they seem to do this more than any other bat, as far as I know. So here are some bats that have been studied in situations where none of these bats have ectoparasites, except for these ones in the wild. This is a study from the wild, but these are all captive bats. And you can see the vampire bats are spending an order of magnitude more time grooming each other than these other bats that are also live in groups. So this seems to be something that vampire bats do more than other bat species. And it's actually about 5% of their time that females spend grooming each other. And the reason it's 3.7% here is that this includes males, which don't groom each other as much. And this is true whether they have ectoparasites or not, whether they're in the wild or in captivity. Okay, so this is what we're predicting. You're going to start as strangers. You're going to increase your grooming is going to start, you're going to start doing this reciprocal grooming. And then once you've established that, you'll start sharing food. So to test this, we get strangers from different places. So here we have sites hundreds of kilometers apart where we get bats. We put them together in captivity. This is a stranger being introduced to 3 bats that are familiar with each other. So we kept bats separated to make sure that they were familiar with their in-group. Then we created these out-group introductions. Sometimes we introduce them in pairs. Sometimes we introduce one to a group of 3, like I just showed you. And then we put everybody together, sort of a free-for-all. So at this point, you could stick to your in-group, or you could start making these out-group relationships. And this is over a period of over 300 days. And during this time, there's also bats born into the group, and we looked at how they formed relationships as well. So, and during this whole time, we're fasting the bats too to induce food sharing, to see who shares food with who. This is accumulation of first donations. The very first time that one bat feeds another. And you can see that these relationships are forming at very different points in time. Only about 15% of the relationships that could have formed did form over a 10-month period. Whereas I think something like, I don't remember the exact number, but most of them were grooming by the end. So grooming happens faster. So one prediction we made is that isolated pairs would bond faster. So the x-axis shows the type of introduction. The y-axis shows the new food sharing rate. You might call this prediction like a college dorm room effect, because you're stuck together. Are you going to form a relationship faster if you don't have anyone else that you could associate with? And so this is what we predict. These ones are going to share fast. They're going to start forming relationships faster than these pairs. And that's exactly what we found. So it's not too surprising, because these bats are either just sticking to themselves or socializing, whereas these bats here have the option to just interact and groom with the bats that they already know. And so just like we predicted, the isolated pairs did start sharing faster. So another thing we predicted is the following pattern. So time here is on the x-axis. The y-axis is the probability of A grooming B. And we can think about pairs of bats as being in 2 categories. The ones where B later fed A, so this sort of successful relationship formed, and the ones where B never fed A. And what we predict is that the grooming trajectories are going to be different for these 2 bats. Specifically, these bats should be grooming, the grooming should be escalating more, the probability of grooming over time. And that's, again, what we found. So the grooming dynamics really predicted the formation of these new food sharing bonds before the food sharing happened. And like I showed you, each of these relationships is forming at a different point in time. And so what I was showing you is what's happening up until that point in time, but what happens after? Well, this increase should only happen before food sharing is cemented. And then after that, you shouldn't see this increase. So after this kind of day 0, the first donation day, the rate of escalation of grooming shouldn't continue to go up. And again, this is what we saw. So after the first donation, the grooming was not, the probability of grooming was not increasing after. And the most important prediction is that the relationships should emerge in a reciprocal pattern, which they did. And for the bats that were born in captivity, it's the reciprocal emergence of new food sharing is not determined by relatedness. Relatedness didn't seem to drive it. Okay, so take-home message here. Vampire bats appear to build up new reciprocal food sharing relationships by testing the waters via grooming, and non-kin relationships can't be explained by phenotypic similarity. They bond faster when they're isolated with fewer bats rather than when they have more opportunities to have a match with more bats. So I think this raising the stakes thing might be really common outside of vampire bats. You know, this might be something that we might expect to see in primates if we could see how their relationships change from the very beginning to the very end, rather than just coming across them as they're fully formed. What I want to pivot to next is, why do the bats form non-kin bonds when they have the option to have kin bonds? Why not just reciprocate with kin? So like I showed you, the bats are sharing food with relatives and also non-relatives. But if you can have reciprocal relationships with these relatives, why do you need these over here? And there's kind of 2 ideas about this. One is that it's just better to have more bats in your network. This is, I think, probably what is the most intuitive idea. However, we have reason to believe that it's actually better to have fewer stronger bonds. And so another possibility is something that I call social bet hedging, which is the idea that it is actually better per capita, per relationship, to have fewer, stronger relationships. But if you invest in more non-kin, if you diversify your investments beyond limited family, then over the long term, this is beneficial because you are more buffered from the loss of any particular relationship. So it's like not putting all your eggs in one basket. So if that doesn't completely make sense to you, I'll explain. It might after I explain the experiment. So the idea here is that we can look at each female's success at being fed in two conditions. So in the treatment condition, we remove a key donor, like a mother or daughter. And in the baseline condition, we can prevent sharing from a non-donor that's never fed the subject in the last 4 years. And so it shouldn't really affect the subject. So how well do they cope with each of these? And the prediction is that there's actually the idea of feeding many donors should buffer you against this situation, but you shouldn't necessarily do better in this situation. Okay, the alternative is that you always do better. So what I'm going to show you here is on the x-axis, this is the investment in non-kin, which is the number of non-kin that you fed per opportunity in the past, I think it was 4 years. How many non-kin are you feeding? And then on the y-axis is how much food do you receive when we do these manipulations? So when we remove non-donor, which is like the control treatment, and then we remove one of your key donors. And the prediction is that for social bet hedging, it's going to, depending on these slopes are going to be totally different from each other. It's not always going to be the case that investing in non-kin is always better. Okay? And that is actually what we found. So under normal circumstances, bats that helped more non-kin did not receive more food. So here bats, they've been feeding more individuals. They're not getting more food for feeding these additional individuals. It almost seems like they're just making a mistake here, right? So this is definitely not a positive slope. We can't say it's not a flat line, but it certainly doesn't look like it's a positive one. However, when you remove this key donor, the females that help more non-kin, they did receive more food. Why did they receive more food? Because they have more bats in their donor network, and these bats basically became the donors that will feed them when their mother is missing, or their daughter is missing, or whoever their key donor is missing. So they suffer a smaller loss of food. And so there's a kind of cryptic benefit to these weak non-kin bonds because they can sort of act as backup donors. But you only see this when you manipulate the network in this way. So these weak non-kin bonds can provide backup donors when primary donors like kin go missing. And the other point I think this makes, again, is that females are really investing in particular individuals, not in the whole group. So there's evidence for these kinds of trade-offs in some other species. So in macaques, there seems to be a trade-off between quality and quantity of social relationships, and also just recently in lance-tailed manakins. There's also evidence that animals lose a relationship that they try to replace that relationship. We see evidence for this in baboons. If a baboon has a mother-daughter that's eaten by a predator, she starts grooming other individuals more and starts extending her grooming, presumably to try to rebuild her social connections that as a way to sort of compensate. And we also see evidence for this in great tits. And what I like about this idea of social bet hedging is that it's looking at how individual behaviors can shape the social network. So normally when we're talking about social networks, we're interested in how your position in a network influences you as an individual. And so there's lots of evidence, always accumulating, of how it really matters your position in a social network. You have more relationships, higher quality relationships. This has all of these benefits for your health, reproduction, survival of offspring. And this is true across a range of different species. And I think what is also interesting is to consider what role do you play in that? So what kinds of decisions can individuals make that actually shape the structure of the network from their point of view? And what other sort of processes can end up shaping the network, which then affects you? So one example would be if you inherit ties if you're born into a group, are you inheriting relationships that your parents have? So do parental relationships get passed on to offspring? When an individual dies, what happens to the rest of the network? Is there rewiring that's based on indirect connections? How strategic are animals in terms of where they end up in the network? Is it pretty much just set by traits they're born with, or are they doing things to sort of form new ties and strengthen ties and switching partners? And this is sort of the whole thing that I'm interested in trying to explore with vampire bats. Now, one of the things to understand here is really to get at what is it when we draw these networks and we're drawing these links between them. We're trying to describe relationships, but what does that mean? What is a relationship? So I'm going to get to the last part of my talk here. And this kind of breaks down into a number of little smaller questions. So we know that bats invest in preferred associate. We know they recognize each other as individuals, and they prefer certain individuals, and they make investments in those individuals. But how stable are these relationships? Do they persist across contexts? Would they persist from the lab to the field if we completely change their social environment? So in a lot of these studies, we're holding them all in captivity, and would they have relationships that are similar if they're just out in the field? Like we have data from both the field and the lab, but it would be nice to actually have this data from the same individuals. Do these relationships that exist inside the roost, do they also have functions outside of the roost? And does higher association lead to increased competition or less competition? And as I'm going to show you evidence that it doesn't increase competition for food. And all of these questions we haven't been able to answer in general because of technological limitations. It's just really hard to study bats flying around at night and know where everybody is and how they're relating to each other. You can't really just necessarily watch that. But we have this amazing new technology, these proximity sensors, which a biologist, Simon Ripperger, who's now a postdoc in my lab, he's developed these over a period of several years with a team of computer scientists and engineers. And proximity sensors have existed, but these are kind of just sort of next state-of-the-art, next generation. They're super light and the resolution is really high. They log encounters with other sensors every 2 seconds, and we can glue them on the back of a vampire bat and track the social networks essentially every few seconds between all of the bats that we sample. And so we can do things like ask the question, these relationships that we've been studying in the lab, do they persist in the field? So this is what we did. We sampled bats from this tree. They were in captivity for 22 months, so almost 2 years. And during that time, we had almost 700 donations we observed, over 3,000 allogrooming events that we observed, and we could see cooperation sort of increasing in particular individuals. So we know a lot about the relationships in captivity. Then we just release them back into the wild and then continue tracking them with these proximity sensors. So here we are releasing this bat back into this tree where it was caught 2 years ago. And what we did is we also put the same proximity loggers on a control group of bats. And so what we found is that the captive bats did in fact reform their social networks when we released them into the wild. And we were able to show this because we also put proximity loggers on a sample of the bats that were never in captivity but lived in the same tree. So here I'm showing, there's also a whole bunch of bats that are untagged. So we're not sampling those ones, but yeah, so we have both previously captive and never captive bats. And just to sort of, this is just a slide to just brag about the resolution of these tags. So this is showing every minute. So you can see the minutes being logged here. This is what the bats are doing inside of this tree. And all this data, we just stream onto a little hard drive, and then we can create these networks. We can have the network slices be minutes or hours or days. And so here what you're seeing is the previously captive bats all mixed in with the control bats. And you can sort of see already the previously captive bats are sticking to each other a little more than random. And so if you integrate this over several days, this is a kind of network you make here. So now the previously captive bats are dark blue, the other ones are light blue. The previously captive bats roosted closer together in the wild, and they roosted preferentially with the bats that they were grooming and sharing food with in captivity. So even in a completely different social environment, these relationships are robust. And they're predicted by food sharing and grooming and kinship. And food sharing and grooming are a little stronger as predictors than kinship. And here I'm showing you data points where every day is, all the networks in one day are collapsed to just one point here. And so there's quite a bit of variation across days, but this is the ability of food sharing and grooming to predict the association rates in the wild. And so we have these networks of wild roosting, we have networks of captive cooperation, and now we're exploring what's going on outside the roost. And we're trying to make what we're calling the bat-cow network. We have bats possibly sharing wounds or sharing whole animals. And so this is stuff we haven't published yet. I hope to show you now if I have time. Yeah, good. Okay, still have some time. So these are bats on a cow. So this is something that people have observed a lot. Two bats feeding from the same wound on a cow, but feeding sequentially, sometimes fighting over a wound, sometimes tolerating each other. There's a whole range of interactions that these bats have with each other that vary from cooperative, affiliative to aggressive and competitive. And so we had a number of hypotheses about whether or not vampire bats socially forage, and if they do, how do they do it? So here are different scenarios, which I'll try to kind of briefly take you through. But basically, this is the one that was supported. So what happens is that they depart individually. They don't leave together as a group. They depart individually, and then they unite briefly with specific partners, but it's the same ones that are occurring over time and over days. So different times on different days, same bats meeting up with each other. And these repeated foraging encounters are predicted by who they're roosting with, who they're grooming, who they're sharing food with, even back in like captivity. And this is true even when you control for the overlap in foraging times. It's not just driven by two bats just foraging at the same time. Okay, so we call this socially biased hunting. And I just want to differentiate it from other possible things that could be happening, which we've shown are not happening. Like for instance, they don't hunt individually and have encounters that are just random. They don't leave together and then hunt individually. They don't coordinate their huntings. They don't leave together and then fly together to the livestock. They don't seem to have one set of individuals they hunt with and then another set that they roost with. It seems to be the same bats. And they definitely don't do a sort of group level hunting where everybody moves out together and then descends on the cattle like one big swarm of bats, which is what some people seem to think in the literature. If you read the literature, some people thought that vampire bats are leaving in these groups and then hunting in these groups. And we didn't see any evidence for that. So what we could see is that, so here's an example of showing just the raw data that they don't depart together. This is time starting at sunset. So 0 here is the sun goes down, and this is the sun coming back up. So in Panama, it's like 6 a.m., 6 p.m. every day is the dark period. It's actually quite interesting. The bats push off their foraging until right before the sun rises. So they do all of this foraging here. This is just one day. We have this, we can make plots like this for many days. I'm just showing you a slice of one day, and I'm showing you, these are the previously captive bats here. These are some of the wild bats. This isn't all the bats, but it's just a sample. And this is the foraging bat. So this is when the bat's out foraging. And then these dots are when they're encountering each other. And so you can see these bats are not leaving together, right? But they are meeting up with each other later. And we have some information about where they're meeting up, but often it's the case that what we need to do is actually have the antennas at the sites where we think they're going to be. And basically, because they're bats, they don't go where you think they're going to go. And so this has been seen with people studying foraging other bats, where you're like, oh, they're going to go to this big ripe fruit tree right here. And then they fly right over that tree and go to one much further away. And this is what these bats were also doing. We corralled the cattle at this one site. They just flew right over. There was a couple that went there, but most of them just go other places. And so we're trying to come up with a way to figure out where they're feeding first so we can focus in on and sort of describe the locations of where every bat is. But what we do know is that they're having these encounters. These encounters are happening more than you expect from just the overlap in time of foraging. And they're predicted by a whole range of things. So this is kind of an overview of all the different kinds of information that we're integrating together. So we've got, you can make different kinds of social networks. So this is, for instance, a network of who's within half a meter of each other within each day. But we can also look at who's within 2 centimeters. So basically bats that are touching each other. And then we can look at whether that is predicting who then meets each other that night. And those correlations tend to be very weak. And you don't really see a strong correlation within each pair of day and night. There was a couple of, or maybe one day and one night where it was strong enough that we could really see that there was a significant correlation. But for the most part, these are weak. But if you look at the correlations over time, like here's 9 days, they're overall, they tend to be positive. So they're biased away from 0 overall. And so if you integrate it over the whole period of time, then you do clearly see that what's happening within the roost is predicting who's meeting up outside the roost. And then this is also predicted by kinship, which we know from microsatellite markers, and the bats that we know, the mother-pup relationships, and all of these interactions which we scored a long time ago in captivity. And interestingly, co-feeding does not predict these foraging encounters. And I think this is an interesting thing to consider. So what we found is that co-feeding in familiar vampire bats is not that differentiated. They tend to just feed with whoever, as long as those bats are familiar. We didn't test unfamiliar bats, but what we know with familiar bats is that they don't have any kind of really strict, clear dominance hierarchy. It's not there's certain bats that always displace other bats like you see in primates. So this is a plot showing a dominance hierarchy in a particular way. So on the y-axis is the probability that a bat or that an individual of a higher rank would win in a sort of conflict over like who wants to sit somewhere, who wants access to some resource. And what you see in a lot of primates is that these dominance hierarchies are very clear. So the probability that 2 individuals 3 ranks away are going to, like this one's going to displace that one, is basically 0. The higher ranking individual always wins the interactions once you get a certain distance away. And the same thing here with long-tailed macaques. And now we look at the vampire bats, and we just don't see that. We see that there is dominant structure, but it's just not very predictable. And they don't have a clear dominance hierarchy. And I think the reason for this is that because the vampire bats don't forage as a group, they're not always coming across food with the same individuals. And so there isn't always a need to decide, well, who's going to be the one who's going to have first priority to this wound, or who's going to have these are not, they're not competitive interactions that are necessarily happening with the same individuals that you're living with, because you don't hunt as a stable moving group, if that makes sense. So we still need to test this idea, but this is the basic prediction that I think will be the case. So just to go back one, so this is all with familiar females. And I think what would happen is that if we introduce bats that are unfamiliar with each other, you'd have very different kinds of interactions. There wouldn't be these very subtle sort of displacements. You would have like fights that occur. And I think most of the competition over wounds or prey is between bats that are unfamiliar. They're not the bats that are frequently roosting together. And if so, this suggests that this is a source of interdependence, because female vampire bats from the same roost that are roosting, grooming, food sharing, meeting up when they're foraging, they're not necessarily always competing. And instead, what we think is going on is these fights that we're seeing over wounds is probably bats that don't know each other. We haven't confirmed this, but I think this is probably the case. So competition is probably more global, whereas cooperation is more local. And this is a factor that this is basically the scale of competition, which has some impact on how bats cooperate with each other. So to come back to the big questions I asked at the beginning, why do the bats share food? I think it's multiple different reasons. So kinship plays a role. I think that it does promote reciprocal returns, although we've yet to like show experimentally that it's that bats will punish cheats by not investing less in them. We have lots of correlational evidence from different kinds of studies that this is the case. And I think that there is a kind of interdependence that exists between these bats, but it's hard, we haven't figured out exactly how you measure that, besides looking at things like the scale of competition, but it's indirect evidence. How do the new food sharing relationships start? Well, they test the waters through clustering and grooming. And now we're putting proximity loggers on the bats to really, when we merge groups, to really look at whether they're also clustering even before they start grooming, which is something we just sort of anecdotally have seen, but we haven't described it in detail. And finally, what do we mean when we say they have a cooperative relationship? It means that they have these associations that are preferred, that are stable across different social environments. So even when we give the bat an option of interacting with 100 more individuals than it had in captivity, these relationships are going to persist, and they're not just based completely on the market of partners. There's a kind of partner fidelity that's built into these. And these relationships are also providing multiple benefits. It's not all just about exchanging food for food. So if I had to guess about what has happened in the evolution of food sharing in vampire bats, which we cannot reconstruct because we don't have intermediate vampire bats that do intermediate food sharing. But if I had to guess, I think this is probably what happened, that you have maternal care, which becomes extended to daughters when they reach adulthood. The daughters are feeding their mothers. This is all explainable by kin selection. I think all you need to get something more complicated is that you have equally related kin. Do you have a bias to feed bats that reciprocate more often? So if you have two sisters you're related to, and is it possible to have a good relationship with one of them and a bad relationship with the other? And I think the answer is yes. And I think that you could bias your investment towards a relationship that's a stronger, that's a relationship that benefits you more. And as soon as you have that going, this you sort of can build reciprocity off of that. Now the experiences you have with individuals might become even more important than the relatedness with those individuals. And if that were the case, then not just the number of individuals you have, but also, can you strengthen and can you create new relationships? That might be a strategy that has benefits once we assume that the relationships themselves are providing a benefit. So bats might be trying to form new relationships as a kind of basically a form of social networking. So this is what we think is going on. I hope in my lifetime we can figure this all out and see if this is the case. But yeah, that's where we are. I'll just say lastly that we're doing studies too on vocal communication in these bats, which I haven't talked much about, but I spelled convergence wrong, sorry. We're looking to see if vampire bats have vocal learning, which maybe they do. We'll tell you maybe hopefully in the next few years. And also in the course of doing these foraging studies, Simon has discovered these new calls, which I've never seen before. So I have something like, I don't know, maybe close to 1 million of these contact calls. I've been collecting these for years when the bats are isolated to make these calls to each other. We know we've shown in playback experiments that they recognize each other. I've never seen these calls. We've only seen them in a foraging context. These are aggressive calls they make when the bats are fighting, but we don't know what these are for. We think maybe they're using them to sort of do something, coordinate foraging in some way. And so with that, I will just thank all these people way too many people for me to go through each of them by name, but I'll just leave this slide there. So I can thank all of these funders and people simultaneously without taking more time. And I can take questions if anyone has questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Carter, for an excellent seminar. So everyone, if you have any questions for Dr. Carter, feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly, or if you want to write in chat, I can help moderate that. So any questions, go ahead.
I have a question. I have so many questions. I'm going to bug you later with all my questions.
Okay.
That was amazing. Thank you. Do you know anything about how access to those wounds relates to the identity of the bat that made the wound?
No, I would love to know that. I suspect there might be some kind of producer scrounger thing going on where some bats open wounds, which then it's nicer to be the bat to take a wound that someone else has made. But that's not something we have explored yet. We had this whole idea of trying to study the interactions at the cattle, but then we realized it's difficult to do that without disturbing them. So yeah, we're still hoping to get more interactions in the wild. The ones that we have in captivity where the bats are displacing each other with these feeders, I don't think they're really simulating the situation in the wild because they're not limited. The blood spouts are not really like wounds. You don't have to make a wound, and so the bats just don't really fight over them that much. But yeah, so the short answer is no, I don't really know anything about that yet.
Thanks.
I'm interested in benefits of bats connecting more with those that they're not familiar with. Clearly, if they need blood meals at regular intervals and they've built up the relationship through maybe grooming and more grooming through to feeding, then this is a very positive thing. But there are also negative things associated with relationships, and I don't think that's been covered in the experiments to date. And for instance, if some threat to the health of the kin and those with whom they spend a lot of time reciprocating with, then there's good benefits to having some eggs in another basket, which is those unfamiliar to them that may be more healthful than, say, if a disease or something has got into those with whom they're with whom they're spending more time. So it seems to me that in an evolutionary sense, there's a great benefit to also be tending that one end of the spectrum that you do not see so much. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, we actually have done a whole series of studies on sickness behavior in vampire bats. I think you're totally right that one of the reasons why, if this is what you're saying, if I understood you correctly, that you should be wary of individuals coming in that are unfamiliar because they're more likely to be carrying pathogens that you haven't been exposed to, and that's certainly the case with vampire bats. And in fact, there's some evidence for that from the fact that one of the ways this is really sad, but one of the ways that we've been trying to control vampire bats is just killing them with a anticoagulant poison. So you put it on their fur and then they spread it via grooming and food sharing, and then everybody dies. And the idea is that we can try to reduce rabies spillover to livestock. And it seems to be the case that this doesn't actually do that. In fact, rabies rates have increased in areas where you kill more vampire bats. And the reason for this seems to be that when you're killing vampire bats, you're killing bats that have already built up a titer to rabies, and you're introducing more individuals. There's more intergroup movement. So all of these males that are able to disperse into these groups, and actually this is what's determining rabies rates. So I'm kind of jumping around all over the place here, but I think this is probably a reason for a sort of outgroup bias. But yeah, there is definitely, I haven't described it in much detail, but there's definitely an in-group, out-group bias. And sometimes when I've introduced vampire bats, I've had like one inside of a little shark cage, and it's like the other bat is attacking, like biting, trying to bite through the cage, just attack this other bat. And one of the ways that we've had to introduce them in a way where we don't see that, because we don't want them attacking each other, is we allow them to vocally interact with each other first before we put them all together. And I think that has reduced that sort of outgroup aggression. Am I answering your questions, or am I just rambling about unrelated things?
Well, I think it does in one sense, but I think the reciprocal, as is so often the case with biological relationships, the opposite could also be true, in that disease could hit the isolated community and wipe the community out. And it may only be those that do have a relationship with outliers, so to speak, the unfamiliar ones, who will be able to get blood meals from them. So I can see why there are benefits in isolating and remaining only with kin and familiar individuals. But there comes a point when health challenges could challenge the kin and those familiar. And unless you got a little bit of something going on outside, so it's like everything else. There's a balance, I think.
Yeah, actually, I didn't even tell you the results of our study, which is just consistent with what you just said. So what we've been doing is we inject bats with LPS, lipopolysaccharide, which makes them sick, lethargic. This is work done by Basti Stuckmeyer, who's shown here, who's going to be joining my lab soon as a postdoc if we can get all the paperwork finished out. But he's been basically making bats feel sick when they're not actually sick. So they have an immune challenge, they have fever, lethargic, they act sick, and then looking at how this affects like their grooming and their food sharing. And basically what you see is it depends on the relationship. So a mother, the sick pup, is not going to decrease her food sharing or grooming to that pup, but she will probably have decreased social grooming with an unrelated pup. But much of the sort of social distancing, if you will, that's occurring is not due to bats avoiding other individuals that are sick, but more often that the sick individual is just less social, less interested in interacting with other bats, and just sort of goes off by itself and sits alone by itself. And so that seems to be explaining most of the social distancing. It's just a byproduct of when you're sick, you're less social. But that doesn't extend to things like rabies, because we know that that's not necessarily how bats act when they're rabid. We're actually doing studies now on what happens with rabid vampire bats, because we have 1,000 hours of video of bats that have rabies was introduced to a colony, and this is not our lab, but another lab that's studying like vaccines for rabies. And so maybe we'll know something about what exactly happens when rabies starts spreading in a colony of bats. But I don't know about that yet.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Carter. I really appreciate you taking your time to virtually educate us on vampire bats. We really appreciate it, and it was a very interesting talk.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to email me. You can just find my email on my website, socialbat.org.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks so much, Jerry.
Yeah, no worries. This is fun. Just glad to make it.
Can I follow up with you with other questions later?
Sure. Yeah. Do you want? You guys are you guys using this space for